Okay, guys, 410. We're efficient in business. We're efficient in running the webinar and the event as well. So let's move forward. I hope that you got some break from us and you will bear with us for those next 2 hours. Now, another awesome keynote from Google. I know that usually you are the most excited to hear from them. So they talked about policy. Now we are asking them about Core Web Vitals. Core Web Vitals, I don't know if you heard about that stuff. I did heard about them last month. So I think I'm late to the party. Hope not. As far as I know, from the beginning of 2021, they will become even more important than now in terms of SEO, but also health score of the manager accounts. So I would like to introduce to you Martin Split, developer advocate from Google Search Relations. Martin, happy to have you, and we would love to hear what you have to say about Core Web Vitals. Any tips, any pointers, any best practices you can share with us so we could stay afloat now, but also after the year will pass. We are psyched to hear all that stuff. So the stage is yours. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you very much for having me, and hello everyone. I know that you had a fantastic first block before the break, and now you had a little bit of a break, and I hope that you're all ready to jump into this topic with me for the next more or less 20 minutes. All right, so as introduced, Core Web Vitals is relatively new, and today I'm here to talk a little bit about what they are and why they matter, and I'll leave you with a few ideas and pointers where to look at in terms of making improvements along these lines. So we'll look at what actually is Core Web, or what is the challenge that Core Web Vitals is trying to tackle, and that is what is web page performance. What does that mean? How do we measure that? And why has that been a source of constant change, basically? Then we look at what are the Core Web Vitals actually, and then last but not least, I want to talk a little bit about why they matter in terms of the page experience signal that is, as was just said, coming in 2021 in Google Search, and how that relates to the Core Web Vitals. All right, so let's start with what actually is web page performance, because that's a thing that a lot of people kind of like go over as if it would be something relatively simple. It's like, it's how fast the page loads. Nah, it's not really just that. It's a little more than that. Oh, it's how fast the website is. Yeah, but what does a fast website mean? What's a fast website? And basically, fundamentally, page performance is a continuously ever-evolving attempt to quantify, so to get numbers and measurable metrics on how fast and well a web page works for the user. That isn't really helpful either. So let's try to clarify that a little more. So let's look at one of the first things that we looked at historically when it came to how fast is a website. Historically speaking, websites, or how fast we would be able to consume the content of a website, was directly bound to how fast was our internet connection and how fast was the server responding to things and how far away were the server and me. Basically, what would happen is I would point my browser to a website that would set an HTTP request. This HTTP request has to travel, which means if I'm in Zurich, Switzerland, and the server is in the US, it has to travel hundreds of thousands of kilometers. No, wait, no, that's not hundreds of thousands of kilometers, like lots of kilometers. How far is it actually? Anyway, it doesn't matter. It has to travel multiple seconds over the wire to the US and then all the way back before it can even reach me. Even if the server would be like instant response, it would just still take multiple seconds until the data actually is there. If I'm then on a slow network, that makes it even slower. So if it takes my request, let's say, 5 seconds to reach my internet service provider's host, and then from the internet service provider's host backbone connection to the server another couple of seconds, and then it goes back a couple of seconds, and then it takes a couple of seconds back, then we're easily in like the 10 seconds or longer range, and that isn't good. So the first thing that you could do is you could use a CDN to reduce that. You could put the server closer to me. So if I am a customer from Switzerland, maybe you have a server in Switzerland, maybe you have one in London or in Barcelona or in Berlin. So that basically the entire connection is less than a second to just travel from my computer to your server and back. So that's one thing. The other thing is you would then try to make sure that your server responds as quickly as possible. So it has to have enough CPU, it has to have enough RAM, maybe a solid state network connectivity, faster network connectivity, closer to the hubs maybe. So there are a lot of things that you can fine tune on that level. But is that a good metric to serve or to measure how fast websites are today? Well, it has historically been a relatively good proxy. Back in the days when we were fetching HTML, basically you would make this request, you get HTML back, and then that's it. The website would display and everyone was happy. However, these days it isn't good enough. Let's have a look here. We have two websites. One is a.example.com, the other one is b.example.com. A.example.com makes the request the same time as we make the request for b.example.com. And a.example.com maybe is a PHP script, a Python script, a Java, and a Java application, a Node.js application, doesn't matter. Maybe it needs to make some network lookups, maybe it needs to take things from a database, so it doesn't actually start to answer immediately. While b.example.com does answer immediately. The response comes back immediately, but it's just a piece of HTML that loads a script, which means now I need to make another request to get the script that then actually starts displaying things for me. Whereas the other website, the a.example.com, has now done its database work and has now returned some HTML, and the browser can immediately display this. So time to first byte wise, b.example.com was faster because it responded quite immediately, whereas a.example.com took some time to compile the HTML for me on the server. So the time to first byte on a.example.com is worse, yet it displays content for me quicker. Because once it responds, it actually gives me the data that I need, and then I can see it in my browser and I can continue with my business. Whereas in the other case, I have to load other resources first to even get to the content. And then the app.js gets downloaded, and then it has to make API requests, and then it actually gets the content, and then it renders. So that might take longer. And that's a reality today when we talk about client-side rendered applications using JavaScript. Oftentimes, this is the situation that we find ourselves in. So time to first byte oftentimes is not a good proxy for fast in terms of the user. If you think from a user's perspective, the first website is the faster one because it gives me the content quicker, even though on the network it took it longer to serve the first request. Well, what can we do about it? Well, we can look at other metrics, right? And we have been doing that over the time. So then you might, instead of just looking for the first byte to arrive on my side, you might look for when is the page complete? So when has this JavaScript thing downloaded? When has the content actually been fetched from the API? When does it stop loading things onto the website? When is it actually there? Turns out that's really, really hard to say, because sometimes you load JavaScripts that actually don't matter. They make no difference in terms of when I see the content. So then we are waiting for something that doesn't actually influence how quickly things are visible and usable for the user. What if there are like continuous requests to ping things like, I don't know, have a chat kind of thing where it pings the server every now and then for new messages? When is that website ready? That's not very easy to figure out. DOM content loaded was one of these events that we added to the browsers to give us a feeling for when do all the sub-resources finish loading as well as the actual document loads. But that wasn't really helpful because it didn't really tell us much about when would we actually see things, especially, again, when JavaScript is in the picture. It downloads a bunch of stuff from the network, great, but having finished downloading everything from the network is not necessarily the moment when I actually can see something on the page. So then we came up with speed index, which basically gives you a function of how quickly can we get most of the visible content done and when do changes stop happening visually. But that was a relatively tricky and sensitive metric, as well as the first Contentful paint. So we figured, hey, maybe we can wait until the browser actually actually paints the pixels of the content. But then what does that mean? If the first paint the content that is painted is just the menu, is that useful? What is the main content? It's not very easy. So maybe we have to check what's the first meaningful paint. What's the first moment when we think something useful and meaningful for the user is displayed on the page? That metric proved to be very, very brittle and very, very sensitive to lots of small changes on pages that are not impacting user experience, but do impact the metric quite hard. So that wasn't a good metric either. Then maybe painting and showing you something isn't all that matters, right? What if you are trying to register for something or try to buy a product? Now everything is there real quick, like you can see the buttons and the input fields, but when you click on them and you tap on them on your phone, nothing happens. Is that a fast website? If you see things immediately, you see a form to log in, but then when you try to enter your username, that takes 10 seconds. That's not a fast website. As far as I'm concerned, as a user, a fast website would let me actually put my username into the field immediately, but it doesn't. It lets me wait 10 minutes. So at 10 minutes, that would be terrible. I mean, I've seen that actually. I've actually seen intranet applications that do that, but even 10 seconds is just painful, right? So that's not a good metric. So maybe we need to measure the time to interactive. But then again, what if the main thing that you want to do is literally just draw things so that the user can consume them, but not really like interact with them? So then they're getting a bad score for something that doesn't really affect the user. That's also not very helpful. So we kept trying and we kept coming up with new metrics, and that actually led to a lot of changes and challenges for development teams. So first things first, it's really hard to measure performance reliably and in a useful way. Reliable is very hard to accomplish with measuring performance, especially from a user's perspective, because you can't really just like have a machine measure the physical and psychological frustration of every user out there. That would be the most reliable performance measurement, probably. So we have to come up with these different metrics, and some metrics just don't tell us much. Like the time to first byte was great 10 years ago, 20 years ago, but now isn't as useful anymore. First meaningful paint was very, very sensitive. You would make minimal changes and get huge differences in first meaningful paint measurements. They were not very helpful because you would just say like, but the users are still happy, and we tested with the users, and this metrics value that we get here doesn't really mean anything to us. So then why would we use this metric? So they are either too rough or too sensitive. It's a very hard balance. It's very hard to strike the right balance between these two extremes. And also, again, these metrics don't really represent user experience. There are many, many factors, and it's very, very hard to figure out a good way of modeling what makes a website delightful to a user in terms of performance. As I said, with the form, I wanted to be responsive to my inputs as quickly as possible. It's okay if some parts of the blah, blah, blah around the form doesn't load. That's okay. I don't care as long as I can immediately like start to log into the thing. But how do you know that as a machine? It's really hard to tell. So it's very hard to make metrics in a way that it approximately reflects what users feel when they use and interact with your website. Also, then you have to be careful on how you measure these things. If you have used Lighthouse, you might have seen values that differ from machine to machine. If I am on a relatively recent laptop, I will get different results than if I would run the same tests on an old phone. Also, how is my internet connection? If you are using a fast fiber connection from home or from your office, versus the users that you have are in rural, I don't know where, on a mobile connection with their old phones, that's very, very different situations. And you might see like, oh yeah, but on my latest and greatest phone here, where I have 4G or 5G maybe even, I have a fantastic experience. It's really fast, but then all your users are in rural areas, and they are just like sitting there waiting for a loading spinner to go away 10 seconds or longer. That's not really a good experience. So you want to have real user metrics whenever possible so that you can see how actual users are seeing the performance on your page. But then again, also, that can have a bias, because if your website is really slow, then people with slow devices will just not bother. they will go to your competitors, they will go to other people, they will use apps instead of the web. Whereas you would then see like, oh, all our users on mobile devices of the latest generation, and they are having fantastically fast connections. That's because everyone who does not is just not using your product. But if you would optimize for them, more people might actually use your product. And also, you can't really, if you are a website that has not that many users, then how do you get these real user metrics in a useful quantity? So you do want to be able to also test things before they go live, right? You don't want to put a potentially bad version of your product out there on the web and then a month later see that everyone hated it because it was really, really slow. You want to be able to measure this in a lab before you go live. So that's tricky. How do these metrics transfer across the lab data versus real user metrics, and how consistent can we make them across them? And also, as we changed metrics, lots of people got angry with us because it is hard. You're basically trying to reach moving goalposts, right? It's like, oh, we optimized the night. There's a beautiful story from a company that gave a presentation about this recently at an SEO meetup. They optimized for one metric, and they made their website really fast according to this one metric. But then they realized, oh, wait a minute, actually, people are now looking at another metric because they found this metric to not be very useful. And then Lighthouse updated from version 5 to version 6, changing the way they score. So they had really high scores in version 5, but then the scores dropped significantly into version 6. And they were like, why is this happening? And then they understood, oh, so our website loads fast and shows content really fast, but actually we're an interactive website. We want people to interact, and it takes really long until they can actually interact with our website. So that was frustrating, and I'm sorry to say that that's the reality when we are all trying to figure this out together, right? You're not alone in this. So when these metrics change often, it's really hard to invest in making things better according to these metrics. So what are the core web vitals then? I haven't said anything about the core web vitals. Well, fundamentally, they are new metrics for web developers to measure and improve the user experience of their site in terms of performance. The data is already there. We have put them in Lighthouse, in the Chrome DevTools, and PageSpeed Insights. Google Search Console has a core web vitals report. Webpagetest.org has them, and there are JavaScript APIs if you want to get them into your own tooling and solutions. If you want, there's a blog post about this. If you search for Core Web Vitals, you'll find more information on that. And the good thing is we define goals that you want to hit with them, and these goals are realistic. They are based on research that we did with real-world websites, and we found out, so this looks like a good threshold to meet. We'll look at the specific thresholds in a moment. But most importantly, we try to not update them too frequently anymore. We will rethink them on a roughly yearly basis, but we obviously will eventually update things as the web emerges, as our understanding emerges, as we get better at measuring how users feel about websites and how we can quantify that. There will be updates to Core Web Vitals, but we won't make these decisions as much ad hoc as it used to be. There's now a more paced cadence on re-evaluating them. But now the first metric that is part of the Core Web Vitals is 3 metrics. The first one is largest contentful paint. We try to measure the visible loading time. It's similar to first contentful paint and first meaningful paint probably, but it's slightly different. We are trying to find out when is the main content likely visible, when is the largest part of your website probably there. If that is under 2.5 seconds after the page started loading, you're in the good. If it's taking you 4 seconds or up to 4 seconds, that's something that you want to look into. And if it takes longer than 4 seconds for this to happen, then that's considered poor performance. And you definitely want to improve on that. The second one is not as much about when things start to appear, but when can I start to actually do things with it? When can when does the website start to respond to user inputs? Because as JavaScript is basically doing things on the main thread, That means the browser is now processing JavaScript rather than responding to user input events like scrolling, focusing an input element, typing into an input element, these kind of things, clicking on a button, clicking on a link, these kind of things should be able to happen roughly under 100 milliseconds. So 0.1 seconds is what you have in terms of just do your work, and then after 0.1 seconds, you should be able to let the user interact with your website. Up to 300 milliseconds is also okay. It needs improvement, but it's in the yellow. If it takes you longer than a third of a second, then that means that's not exactly great. If you're struggling to meet this, definitely look at web workers. There is a possibility to offload a bunch of work that you might need to do to set things up into a separate thread, into a web worker, and then send messages to let the main thread know that the work is done or whatever the outcome of the work is. You can make network requests, all that kind of stuff in web workers, which offloads work from the main thread, and that means the main thread is available quicker for input processing. And then there's the cumulative layout shift, which is measuring how stable the website is, the visual stability, which means how much of the stuff on the website keeps shifting around when you wouldn't expect it. You want to be under 0.1, that's a good value. Under 0.25 is acceptable, but would need improvement. More than a CLS value of 0.25 is poor. That means there's a lot of movement on the page after it first displayed that you want to avoid. But what do these values mean? Well, imagine this. You are on a website and you want to tap and scroll maybe. And then as you tap, a button appears and you click that button and you're like, what happened now? And then another thing opens or a pop-up opens or something like that. You don't want that. That's bad experience. So what we try to measure here is exactly that, how much of that happens. And we take the area of the website, so how much of the screen is affected by this, and how much does it shift. In this case, pretty much half of the page is affected because this half gets pushed down, and then there's like this additional click me button. And the area where the blue arrow is pointing, that is pretty much, that's the percentage of shift. So here, 50% is multiplied by 14%, which is this area where the button appears, which gives you a CLS of 0.07. If the button would be higher, or if it would be shifting the entire half of the page, that would be a considerably larger amount of CLS, and that would probably be in the poor. So what do you have to do about Core Web Vitals? Definitely learn. You can go to web.dev to learn a lot more about how Core Web Vitals are being measured, how they work, and what you can do to improve your page around them. It just makes a lot of sense because we are leveraging these metrics for all sorts of things, and I'll show you one thing that comes next year in a moment. So definitely understand what these metrics mean and how you can measure them for your website. Test everything, test your mobile pages, test your desktop pages. If you have AMP pages, test them as well. And you can automate this and put it into your build process. There's things like Puppeteer or Headless Chrome and Lighthouse let you automate these things so that you can automatically get them measured by lab data whenever you're building a new version of your site. And this is why it matters specifically. Next year, 2021, we introduce the new page experience ranking signal in Google Search. The ranking signal takes a bunch of ranking signals that we already have, like the mobile friendliness. Is your website mobile friendly? Is your website hacked or has malware on it? That's the safe browsing part. Is it using HTTPS or not? Does it have intrusive interstitials? All these kind of things are now being packaged together with the Core Web Vitals that we take from real user metrics from the Chrome User Experience Report. And this becomes one of the signals that goes into ranking, into the ranking in search. It's called the page experience ranking factor. We don't have a specific release date for it. It's going to happen in 2021, and we will announce it up front, but we don't have a specific announcement date yet. For page experience, page speed, which means the Core Web Vitals and mobile user experience, are not new. We're just repackaging them, basically. So both of these things have been important beforehand. We haven't really specified how we measure page speed, and now with the Core Web Vitals being public, we can say Core Web Vitals are definitely a big part of how we measure page speed, or are how we measure page speed in search ranking. And these and other things, as I said, HTTPS, safe browsing, all that will form this new page experience signal. And you have plenty of time to look into Core Web Vitals and make sure that your website is doing well according to the new Core Web Vitals. But we will announce this properly next year before we actually make the introduction happen. But this is basically a pre-announcement. Just be aware that in 2021, there will be a new search signal for this. And also, AMP will then no longer be a requirement to be in the top stories carousel. AMP is still a fantastic way of building fast websites and building lightweight mobile experiences. It's not a requirement to be in the top stories, though, when the page experience signal launches. You should check your pages for this. As I said, all the testing tools have Core Web Vitals signals and metrics integrated now. And if you use Search Console, the new Core Web Vitals report in Search Console gives you an overview of how your pages are doing according to the new Core Web Vitals metrics. And stay tuned for the announcement for the page experience signal in 2021. And with that, I'd like to say thank you very much for listening. And if we have any questions, we can have a look at those. Yeah, we do have questions.
Yeah, we have two questions, one from Paul, one from Mateusz, but considering that we took a little bit longer time than expected,
sorry.
I will allow myself, no problem. It's always good to hear interesting stuff, even if it takes a little longer. So I will let myself to deliver you those questions via email, and we will deliver the answers to the place after the webinar. So thank you very much, Martin. We are staying tuned and we are reading all the updates. I hope that more guys here were advanced in terms of the HTML and coding than I was. If not, I will share the recording and pass it to your developers, pass it to your ad ops, because I know that business-oriented people like myself can sometimes hear just some hieroglyphs. Yes, am I pronouncing it well? From the presentations like that, but mostly engaging. So thank you once again. Pleasure having you with us, and let's move forward.